I'm Robert Bruegmann. I'm editor of Art Deco Chicago, published by the Chicago Art Deco Society, and you're watching Author's Voice.
Welcome to Author's Voice, connecting authors to the world. You're watching Stranger Than Fiction, and I'm your host, Angie Watson. Today, we're talking about Art Deco Chicago, Designing Modern America. It is published by the Art Deco Society and distributed by Yale University Press. It's $75, and thank you to them. My guest today, and I want to welcome, is the editor, Robert Bruegmann. So thank you for being here. I'm excited to have this chat with you. This is our first time meeting, but I'm excited for what's ahead.
My pleasure, Angie. Let's talk about the book.
Let's get going. Well, first of all, you are the editor, so tell us a little bit about how you came to be involved in this project.
Well, in about 2011, I was approached to write an introduction to this book that I didn't know about until that time. The Chicago Art Deco Society has been around since the early 1980s, and they have wanted to do something for a long time. So they finally got it off the ground in the early 21st century. They asked me to do an introduction, and I thought I would knock that off in a week. And as it turned out, it was clear that this was a much bigger project than a small volunteer organization was really capable of pulling off with the folks they had, so I morphed into being editor, and that led to 6 years of just the most intense work trying to bring this really big, complicated book into being. And it's now here, and I think we're all delighted with it. But it started out as a very small assignment to writing an introduction.
Well, it is incredibly impressive, and I think I mentioned to you before, it's clearly a labor of love, and I think from a lot of people, but it is also very much a scholarly work of art history. I mean, it's amazing in how comprehensive it is. Before we get further, in case there are people who aren't aware, can we talk a little bit about what Art Deco is? Because it's very stylistic, and it has a very distinct and easily identifiable aesthetic.
Well, yeah, I'm not sure actually that it's so easy
to me, yes, okay.
Art Deco as a term was actually invented in the 1960s. It had not been used in the period between the wars. The name was really popularized by a man named Bevis Hillier, a writer in London who published a book called Art Deco of the 1920s and 1930s in 1968. So that's when the big revival starts. The term Art Deco, and he could have used 10 or 12 other terms, but he took that term because of the associations with the Decorative Arts Fair exposition of 1925 in Paris. And because he did that, a lot of people thought that Art Deco was essentially French luxury products of the 1920s, and they thought that it really came to an end about 1930, and that it was a sort of successor to Art Nouveau. Well, I think that was actually unfortunate, because when you hear that term, when you saw the name of the show, the exhibition, it was the Exposition of Decorative Arts, which didn't mean that things were decorated, it just meant they weren't fine arts. So it was not fine arts, and it was industrial as well as decorative. So, and it wasn't necessarily French, because there were all kinds of things that were going on at that fair. So when we decided to do the book, we had to decide what we thought Art Deco was. And we could have taken that more traditional point of view and said that it was luxury French products, essentially 1920s. But instead, we decided that if we're going to make the case for Chicago, Chicago's great contribution was actually more in the 30s than in the 20s, and if anything, more in product design than in architecture. Because when you look at Schwinn and Radio Flyer and Motorola radios and Sears and Montgomery Wards, these are the things that really changed the world. So we decided to take a big tent definition and use Art Deco as meaning much of the modern design that wasn't strictly historical revival on the one hand or European avant-garde on the other.
No, that's wonderful, and thank you. So this is a project of Chicago Art Deco Society, but it's also a collaboration, and I believe Chicago History Museum is one of your primary collaborators, is that correct?
Yes.
And this is in conjunction with an exhibit that opened, I think, last week and runs through to December
Right.
2nd. I do want to talk about that a little bit and let everybody know there is an actual exhibition that goes along with this. I haven't been yet, but it should be fabulous. But can you talk about the connection between the book and the exhibition that's currently going on?
Sure. When we started doing the book, we thought, well, it would be great if there was an exhibition on the same topic. So we went and talked to the curators at Chicago History Museum, and it turned out that Libby Mahoney, who was the senior curator there, had been wanting to do something like this for some time. She and Sharon Darling, the former curator there, had put together an actual plan for an exhibition on just this topic, but it just couldn't get traction for a while. Then what happened was the Terra Foundation decided to do a project called Art Design Chicago, in which they were helping to fund a whole suite of exhibitions, publications, events connected with Chicago as an art center. That was I think, the impetus that then allowed the Chicago History Museum to move ahead. Because there was a difference in sort of the subject matter, a little bit of difference in timing, we couldn't make the book the actual catalog for the exhibition, but the Chicago History Museum was willing to let the book serve as the companion volume. So we have an exhibition which is really about the 30s. It's Chicago by Design, Chicago Streamlines America. So it's about the 30s and about streamlining. The book is about the 20s and the 30s. So the book has a larger purview in terms of, well, both subject matter and chronology. But there's a great deal of overlap between the two things. And I think both of them are very eye-opening for a lot of people in Chicago who just have never seen a lot of these products and a lot of these design objects.
Well, I'm excited to that, and if you're in the Chicago area, please go by Chicago History Museum and see that exhibition, as well as pick up a copy of this book, $75. My next question, and I think you touched on it just a little bit, was why and how Chicago became so prominent in the movement, because you touched on a lot of people associate Paris, especially with Art Deco, and what I'm getting to is the World's Fair in the 30s and how that may have helped move Chicago to the forefront of that.
Well, I think the way art history has normally been told is that it's a history of the avant-garde. Now, the avant-garde, that term was taken from the military. It was the advanced troops that went ahead to scout out the land. So the avant-garde traditionally, and particularly in Europe in the 20th century, was a set of people who wanted to start all over again. They wanted to throw out all the conventions, all the traditions, and especially they wanted to throw out middle-class, middle-brow aesthetic standards and start all over again with something new and clean and different. And that's the story that I think a lot of people have tried to fit Chicago into. And when they do that, they would find things like Frank Lloyd Wright and Louis Sullivan in the late 19th century, and then Mies van der Rohe coming in 1937 and doing a lot of work after World War II. And so that so-called first Chicago school and second Chicago school became the mantra for Chicago's great place in design. But when you think about it, this is a little bit silly because Chicago was never really an avant-garde city. Chicago has always been a middle-class place and a middle-brow place, to be fair. And so I think that we had to do something very different. We had to say, we're not going to tell that story. We're going to tell the story of things that people at the time thought were modern. And much of that was product design. All of these manufacturers that did things that were clearly modern, new materials, new plastics and Bakelite, new forms. And these were things that really transformed America. The Mixmaster, for example, by Sunbeam, or the cold spot refrigerator by Sears. These things made life incredibly different for millions of Americans in a way that those European avant-garde folks who thought they were going to transform the world by design could only dream of. Chicago was really the place that I think that the transformation of life that happened in the 20s and 30s really took place. It was through products designed, made, and distributed from here.
That's wonderful. That's a wonderful explanation. I was thinking as you talked about that, about how pervasive Art Deco is or was in the lives of everyday citizens during that particular time. And one of the things that stands out to me is my great-grandparents' home in Texas is full of Art Deco, which would seem really odd, but I remember one of the things that I loved as a little girl growing up was an Art Deco radio that they had. And radio was such a huge thing with Roosevelt and the fireside chats. And there's actually a radio, or there's a section of it talking about Zenith. Right. And the radio within the book. Can you tell us a little bit about that and those sorts of things?
Yeah, I think the radio is a perfect example of the way a product that would bring the world to even the most remote parts of the United States. And if the radio was one thing, certainly the rural electrification, and then the telephone, because the telephone was a Chicago product. Although some of these were designed in the East by the Bell Laboratories, they were produced at the Western Electric plant, one of the great industrial complexes of the country in the 1920s and 1930s. So the telephone that was produced in 1937 was probably the most ubiquitous household product for decades until it was supplanted by a similar one in the 1950s. And actually, if you think about it from another point of view, talk about women's fashion, for example, yes, where you would have Paris fashion for those who were very wealthy, but then if you were let's say the wife of someone that worked at the meatpacking plant, or you were a farmer's wife, you could get from Sears or Montgomery Ward fashion that was really pretty much up to date, and you could have it and delivered to you even in the remote rural area, so that when you were walking down a sidewalk and you saw a woman coming in 50 feet away, you couldn't really tell at first glance whether this was the wife of a millionaire with this Paris fashion, or whether this was something that came out of Sears or Montgomery Ward. So I think there was the creation of this consumer culture through Chicago products just changed the world in a way that it's hard to imagine today.
Yes, I agree. It was so very attainable, yes, and for everyone. So I want to get more into the book now and a little more specific about that. So it's got 325 images and 101 key works. Is there a favorite section, or are there images that just really spoke to you as you were working through this?
I think the image that we found most compelling was a Sears Craftsman air compressor. A very pedestrian object in many ways, but it was just such a beautiful thing. It was perfect geometries, and then this red color. It was fully the equivalent of any of these designs that are in all the design books by Marcel Breuer or Mies van der Rohe. But the other thing about it was that little compressor, which it was a portable compressor, so it allowed, let's say, a workman or a homeowner to take it with them and, let's say, attach it to paint so that they could spray paint the house. This created a do-it-yourself market that had never been seen before. And this is true of all these cast aluminum hand tools that Sears made, and a whole bunch of other objects that made it possible for ordinary people to have some of the same things that were once available only to the richest and most powerful members of society.
Is there, well, I'm a Hyde Parker, so I want to throw this in about the architecture. I noticed that St. Thomas More Church on Kimbark is in the book, and I happen to live a block away from that. And I think when I first moved to Chicago, that was a building that just really stood out to me. It was really different and beautiful, and not something that I'd seen in other places that I had lived. The other building, I know, the Board of Trade building, everyone talks about, and I'll let you talk about that in a minute. But you cannot have this conversation to me and talk about Chicago and not talk about the Union Carbide building, because it is iconic, just worldwide iconic. It's got the green and gold and the marble,
Right.
and it is truly something to behold. Can you talk to us a little bit about that in that section of the book?
Yeah. I think that the Art Deco architecture was very often quite eclectic. So with St. Thomas Church, we're talking about a kind of reinterpretation of Gothic. Whereas with the tall buildings, the setback skyscrapers like Carbide and Carbon, the Palmolive building that's on the cover of the book, these are buildings that really stripped down to essentials, but they never threw away the basic tenets of the Western tradition. And those were ideas about proportion. The buildings have a certain relationship to the human figure. Symmetry, a kind of order that you always know where you are in the building, and traditional notions of beauty. Those were never thrown away, even when these buildings became quite modern. Now, I think that compared to, let's say, New York or Los Angeles, the Chrysler building in New York or the Richfield building in Los Angeles, the Chicago buildings tend to be much more sober, much more straightforward. And I think that was always the thing about Chicago. It was not the place where these ideas originated. It was the place where the ideas came in, they were standardized, they were made systematically more simple in order to construct them or to make them, and then distributed to the world. So the Palmolive building, for us, is the sort of type, the prototype of the Art Deco building, and you'll see little Palmolive buildings all over the country, from the Jackson, Mississippi to Kansas City to San Francisco. They're everywhere.
Well, I think straightforward is a really good descriptor for that. I love Adler Planetarium, and to me that's one that's also very straightforward, and the bronzes with the astrology on the inside, probably one of my favorites. There are so many. When you initially think about it, or I guess as a newbie to Chicago, you don't realize how profound Art Deco is until you really spend some time in the city and you really begin to study and you really begin to see how prolific it really is. So I think something that we'll mention to people is there's also a Twinkie in there. Do you want to talk about that for a minute?
Well, the Twinkie, I think, is a great example of one of the controversies in the book, and we had a lot of them among our group that was doing the editing and the writing. There were those who thought that the Twinkie was a sort of a perfect Art Deco streamlined object. It looks a lot like, we have a picture of the Olson truck against a locomotive, a streamlined locomotive, and those forms are sort of surprisingly similar. Okay, was this an accident? Was it the Twinkie? Was it the fact that that was the easiest way to get it out of the mold, that the mold was like that? Or was this something that was conscious? Well, we went around and around on that, and finally we decided, well, we'll leave it in there and we'll just leave it up to the reader to decide. We think that if they had wanted to make this sort of fancy and to disguise the fact that it was just this little streamlined object, they would have put icing on it or they would have made some other form to it. But the fact they left it naked like that, as if it were just that streamlined form, like a dirigible or a blimp, I think suggests that this really was part of that same visual universe of the Art Deco. And there was, if not conscious effort, at least there was no objection to having it be in that same kind of format.
We are deeply into our show, and I just realized I forgot a bit of housekeeping. So I'm going to go back and mention, if you're watching this on Facebook Live or our website, please use the comments to submit a question, include your name and where you're from, and most importantly, again, don't forget to order a signed book right now. You can go to authorsvoice.net to get a copy sent directly to you. So we can get back to our interesting business of talking about Art Deco in Chicago. I think we have some images that it would be great if we could show. We've got Chicago Civic Opera. Is that correct? One of the images. And we've also got, there we go.
That's the curtain painted by Jules Guerin, and then that color scheme is by Guerin as well. Just a spectacular set of colors and forms And in this case, I think largely coming from Paris in
Yes.
the 1920s.
But it also gives our audience a great idea of how gorgeous the aesthetic is in this book as well. Just really beautiful visual imagery. And were some of these from, or a lot of these were from the Chicago History Museum's collection, is that correct?
Yes, yes.
I think, okay, go ahead. I was just going to mention we've got another one of our images up, and that is the
Chicago Board
Board
of
of
Trade.
Trade. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and this is one of the great Holabird and Root buildings. The two great firms were Graham Anderson, Probst and White, who did the Lyric Opera, and then the Board of Trade was done by Holabird and Root. And those two firms dominated in the big buildings and the institutional buildings of the day.
I wanted to, you touched on this a little bit too, but to make sure that people understood that Art Deco is actually an entire visual universe. I think that's the best way to describe it, and people use it. And it encompasses architecture and advertising and household objects and clothing and even food design, like the Twinkie that we just mentioned. The breadth and scope of it, I don't think I can find an equivalent in any art movement. Can you think of anything that is quite that expansive?
Well, I think some of the previous movements, like the Baroque,
Mm-hmm.
was a movement that was across the Western world. I think that with Art Deco, we actually move into something that's global.
Yes.
And one of
exactly.
the ironies here is that for the people who advocate for European avant-garde modernism, mm-hmm. they invented this term international style to talk about the steel and glass or concrete and glass buildings of the post-war era. And they tried to make that be the lingua franca across the world. But in a way, I think it was never as pervasive, really, as the Art Deco, which was likewise an international style. And you see it in Chicago, you see it all over this country, but you also see incredible examples of this in Bombay and Calcutta and Shanghai and the French colonies in Africa. It was ubiquitous, and it was a popular style, unlike a lot of the European avant-garde, where people would just scratch their head and think, well, you know, there's nothing there. It looks like a factory. The Art Deco was maybe the last style that was really popular among a whole lot of people.
Do you have a favorite section of this book that you got to work on? Is there something that just you really enjoyed as editor?
Well, you know, I think that it's like buildings. I say they're all my children, and I would hate to, you know, single out specific objects. And actually, I think maybe if I had to say one thing that was really gratifying, mm-hmm. it was that we took 40 different authors, some of them like Neil Harris, which were very senior scholars and would produce complete perfect copy on the first draft. And then we had collectors and enthusiasts who had never really written for a publication, a real book before, and weren't really familiar with a lot of the things that you had to do to be a scholarly publication. And I think that being able to take all of these people and make it into a coherent whole may have been the most gratifying thing about this book. And I guess the other thing, too, is that so much of it was just unknown territory. Nobody had really written about these companies. So when we found the Shure microphone, or we found the archives of Edward Worthington, whom I don't think one person in a million had heard of until we uncovered him, this was really exciting.
Tell us a little bit about those archives and what was in that and how that really impacted the work.
Well, nobody had really known about Everett Worthington, because he died young. He came to Chicago, and he did a lot of work for the 1933-1934 fair. And that's really, in some ways, where the Art Deco style goes public for the first time. So he, for example, he did the Coca-Cola exhibition, and he did the General Motors exhibit. And in those exhibits, he used this new style that was very jazzy and very interesting and arresting at the time. He would have, I think, been one of the people that everyone knew, a household name, like the New York designers like Raymond Loewy or Norman Bel Geddes, because he was en route to New York and he was going to be designing many of the company's exhibition spaces there. Unfortunately, he died very young, and he didn't have family that publicized his work. And so this archive was sitting in California with a very elderly woman, and one of our authors, Bill Meehan from Philadelphia, discovered this, then secured the archives, eventually took it to, gave it to the Hagley Museum in Delaware. So now the world will know about Everett Worthington. Well, there's a lot of stories like that.
You touched on something as well that I did want to mention. There are critical essays from leading scholars in this book. It's just really an incredible, again, as much as it is a beautiful book and something that's got great visual imagery, it is also a scholarly work. I mean, it's chronological, it's been very thoroughly researched and very well organized and really very easy to follow. And once you get into it, if you even slightly have an interest in history or art or architecture, it can really, you can become enraptured just going through it. I found that I was. We're running out of time just a little bit, but I do want to thank you so much for being here. I've really enjoyed talking to you. I feel like we're just starting to scratch the surface and we can get so much deeper into this. So thank you so much for being here.
Very nice to be with you, Angie.
Okay. Before we go, I do want to let everybody know we're reaching the end of the time of this broadcast. We've been talking about Art Deco Chicago, which is published by Chicago Art Deco and distributed by Yale University Press, again at $75. And please do order your copy here. Go to our website, authorsvoice.net. I want to talk to you a little bit about what's coming up on Author's Voice. We've got 2 upcoming shows that I want to tell you about. One is Lady Bird and Friends with author Anastasia Higginbotham. We were talking about earlier how jealous we were of that name. She's going to stop by and answer questions about her latest books for grades 3 through 7, which is Not My Idea. That's going to be on November 6th at 5:30 p.m. And the other show I want to make sure you're aware of is A House Divided with author David Allen Johnson, and he's going to be on the program to answer questions about his latest book, The Last Weeks of Abraham Lincoln. That one's going to be on November 8th, and that's at 3 p.m. Don't forget to ask a question and order your signed copy at authorsvoice.net. And if you're watching this on YouTube after the broadcast, you can still order signed copies, and there will be a link for you. So thank you again. Thank you for watching Author's Voice, and thank you to our guest, David Bruegmann. And don't miss out on this wonderful, amazing book, Art Deco Chicago.